The very fact that you are here at all to listen to this sort of thing indicates, as all philosophy indicates, that there is some unrest. That to be a human being is in some way problematic. That there is such a thing as a life problem. And different people have different ways of expressing it. But there is the reality of what is called in Buddhism dukkha, a very comprehensive word, generally translated suffering, but which might more accurately be called chronic frustration. And I first of all want to try and identify what this human problem is. And we start out from the fact that most of us have a puzzle with ourselves. Not so much with other people, but oneself. Lots of people say that they do various things, like go to the movies, or get absorbed in work, or read novels, in order to forget themselves. It's very commonly said, I want to get away from myself. And when we are left alone with ourselves, in silence, and there is no distraction, civilized people, whether they belong to the Eastern cultures or the Western cultures, tend to feel uncomfortable. This is especially true of Americans, who like to live in an environment of constant noise and to keep their minds busy. What is so much the matter with oneself that you can't stand it? Well, first of all, we don't know what it is. Yourself is the most difficult thing to get a look at. Because in just the same way that you cannot bite your own teeth, that you cannot look straight into your eyes without the aid of a mirror, that you are not apparently directly aware of your brain, for all this reason, yourself is too close to you for you to look at. And it always remains an unknown, a kind of a blind spot in the middle of everything. What color is your head to your eyes? Most people have a vague impression that behind the eyes there is a blank. It isn't black, it certainly isn't white. And you can turn around for all you're worth and never see it. What is behind the eyes? We don't know. But we have ideas about it. And the dominant idea, which most people have, is that there is something called I. When you use the word I, to what sensation do you refer? In what way do you experience I as something existing? Well, I've made a great deal of inquiries into this. And looking at it from the way most people talk, they think of I, myself, as a center of awareness and of action. About halfway between the ears and a little way behind the eyes. Most people don't identify I, myself, with their whole body. Because we say in popular speech, I have a body. We're not liable to say I am a body. We don't feel that certain things that go on in our bodies are things for which I, ego, am responsible. We don't say I beat my heart. We don't say I grow my hair. Because we experience the beating of the heart and the growing of the hair as something that happens to us. We feel our bodies are vehicles, like cars, which were given to us by our parents, and into which at some point in our development, the ego was deposited. Pop. When did you begin to be you? All sorts of theories about that. But generally speaking, I think of myself as the source of voluntary action and of conscious attention. And therefore, outside myself as I, both inside the body and definitely outside the skin, everything else is experienced as not I, as other, as being very largely beyond control, and as in a way alien to me. In the words of the poet Houseman, I, a stranger and afraid in a world I never made. And here lies the root of problems, because it appears that I isn't really very permanent. At least it's messed up with, or mixed up with, a body that grows old and gets achy and inconvenient and finally dissolves. Then what's going to happen to me? Maybe I'm not afraid of actual death, especially if I believe that death is simply extinction, total unconsciousness. There's nothing to be afraid of in that. But it's the process of dying that's so inconvenient. One is so hard to get rid of. And so why? I mean, why am I trapped in this situation? I didn't ask to come here. We say in popular speech, I came into this world. We experience this world as other than ourselves in the sense that we say, you confront reality out there. You must face facts out there. And facts are always, of course, hard facts. Nobody ever talks about soft facts, but there are lots of them. So this sensation of, we could call it generally, of alienation from the universe. Now, of course, it isn't true that you came into this world. You came out of it, as leaves come out of a tree, as a baby comes out of the womb. You're a symptom of the world, in the same way that when a tree produces apples, you call it an apple tree. And a world that produces people is a world that peoples, just as an apple tree apples. In fact, our whole situation of feeling that we are strangers in the earth is a hallucination, and a rather dangerous hallucination, because it moves us to act upon the external world, both of people and of things, in a hostile spirit, so that we talk about the conquest of nature. And this general feeling of resentment, of being involved in a world where there are such things as death, disease, accidents, strife, war, we feel put upon. So, the various forms of Asian philosophy address themselves directly to this problem. But they are not like philosophy in the West, and they are not like religion in the West. If religion is something like Judaism or Christianity, then Buddhism is not a religion. If philosophy is something like the speculations of Kant or Hegel, or even modern philosophers such as Ayer and Reichenbach, then Eastern thought is not philosophy. The nearest thing to Eastern philosophy in the West is psychotherapy, because the objective of psychotherapy is to change the way in which people feel. It is, in other words, a technique for changing one's state of consciousness. And so in exactly that way, these systems that I'm going to talk to you about, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, are primarily methods for changing one's state of consciousness. If, for example, a person is crazy and feels that he is the center of an enormous plot to persecute him, the object of the psychotherapist is to disabuse him of this illusion and get rid of his state of fear. So, in a rather similar way, let us suppose that normal people are simply sharing a collective insanity. which, because it's normal, they think is the ordinary way to be. And it is perfectly clear, I think, that the world is insane, that we are on a collision course, and that therefore there is something to be said for the idea that the normal person's state of consciousness might do with a change, especially if it's a hallucination, and especially if the way we feel our own existence is in flat contradiction to the way our existence would be described by a scientist, such as a biologist, or an ecologist, or a physicist. You know, I think, ecology is a very important science having to do with the relationship between organisms and their environments. Now, when an ecologist or a biologist looks at a living organism, the business of science is to describe what's happening. And he describes the living organism, but he finds out a very funny thing. He cannot describe the organism defined as something bounded by an epidermis without also describing its environment. See, science describes behavior, what is going on. The man behind the microscope has this advice for you. Instead of asking what it is, just ask what does it do. So the behavior of an organism cannot be described without also describing the behavior of the environment. If I describe somebody in the act of walking, and I say nothing about the floor, or the area, the room, or whatever in which he's walking, all I'm describing is a body in empty space dangling its legs. Well, that's not walking. To describe walking, I have to describe the other behaviors or processes going on around the organism. Well, what does that tell me when I find that out? It tells me that what I am talking about is not the organism alone, but something for which we've got only the clumsy term organism environment. Because you see, that's what you are. Imagine, how could you feel the existence of yourself unless at the same time you felt something other? How could you espy any kind of figure, shape, form, unless at the same time you saw its background? Supposing the outlines of my body were coterminous with your whole field of vision, you wouldn't see me. You'd see the microphone, the neck tie, or pattern on the shirt. That would be the thing you were looking at, because you can only recognize anything if it goes along with the background, which is telling us that figure and ground are inseparable. They're different, yes. You have to get the crucial idea of things being different but inseparable. As, for example, the two poles of a magnet are inseparable. You can't have a one-pole magnet, but they're different. The two sides of a coin are different, but inseparable. And so there is a word that I've coined called go with. There are certain things that go with each other, and the organism goes with the environment. And incidentally, the environment goes with the organism. That's harder for us to see, but I shall explain it in due course. A go-withness is a transaction. For example, when we buy and sell, that is a transaction. Now, obviously, you can't buy unless somebody is selling. And you can't sell unless someone is buying. The operations are different. Buying is different from selling. But they're inseparable. And that suggests a certain kind of conspiracy between them. They're explicitly different operations, buying and selling, but they're implicitly one. You and everything you call other are explicitly different. But since you always find these two aspects of experience together, there's a kind of something fishy about it that isn't noticed, that's been overlooked. And that is that they're implicitly one. But you see, in the ordinary course of events, as I've explained, we are not aware of this. And we think that everything not self, or in other words, other, is not merely different from us, but separate. And therefore have this sense of not really belonging in this universe, of finding nature a problem. And that's compounded by the current superstitions of the modern world, the mythology of 19th century science, which is everybody's common sense today, that the world itself is stupid, that it's a huge system of electronic energy buzzing mindlessly, in which we exist by virtue of some statistical flukes. You know that if 1 million monkeys sat with 1 million typewriters for 1 million years, in some course, someday they would type out the Encyclopedia Britannica. They'd eventually have to get around to it, by just chance. So there's the feeling among many people that what we are at this moment is just such an event. And that therefore, if we are going to maintain the human order, our values, our reason, our civilization, we've got to fight the world to maintain it. Because the world is stupid. So in the philosophy of science in the 19th century, you hear people talking about energy lying behind matter as blind energy. Freud defines psychic energy as the unconscious, and furthermore calls it libido, which means blind lust. It's stupid. The unconscious is stupid. It wants pleasure and has no sense of reality. And therefore, Freud would oppose the pleasure principle to the reality principle. And therefore, civilization is always thought of as being against pleasure, because if you let people enjoy themselves too much, they'll fall apart. Because the pleasure principle, the pleasure urge, is stupid by definition. So you see, then we have the sensation of living in an alien world. All this is further complicated by other factors, which I must now go on to explain. The feeling of insularity, of being I alone and separate, has something to do with the way in which we pay attention to life, and with the way in which we think about it. And these two things go together. The task of any school teacher with little children is to increase, isn't it, their attention span. Little children are allegedly, although this isn't always true, little children are supposed not to pay attention to anything particularly for very long. They run from one thing to another. They look out of the window. They pick their noses. They moon around. And so the teacher has to rap the desk and say, "Pay attention!" And all the little children know exactly what's expected of them. That is, to wrap their legs tightly around the legs of the chair and stare at the teacher with a slight frown. That is paying attention. It has nothing to do with paying attention. It is simply an act. But what it does suggest is that we feel that paying attention or concentration involves a certain strain. And actually it has nothing to do with it. Concentration is hindered by strain. But we all say, try to pay attention. Try to think. Try to understand what I'm saying. You don't have to. Your brain will do it for you beautifully if you just give it a chance. Your brain isn't a muscle. You need effort, yes, to lift something heavy. But you don't have to make an effort to think a complicated thought. If you do, the effort will get in the way of the thinking. It'll distract you. But everyone thinks that that's what you have to do. So what you call I, the sensation of I, is, among other things, a chronic sense of mental strain. And it is physiologically located between the eyes. It's been found out that if you relax all sense of tension between the eyes, you will change your sense of your own existence. But that's where it is. That's why the frown comes. And that's why, of course, Buddhas are always depicted with a bright jewel between the eyes, a sign of openness, of illumination. The next thing is, you see, when you pay attention, don't we say in ordinary speech, you can only think of one thing at a time? What do you mean by that? It raises two questions. Why can we only think of one thing at a time? And what is a thing? I love asking children, what do you mean by a thing? And they will say an object, which is another way of saying a thing. It doesn't help at all. One very smart child once said to me, a thing is a noun. And she's quite right. Because you can't think, and to think and to thing are the same process, without using words or notation of some kind. You can think in words, you can think in numbers, and you can think in simple images like squares, triangles, crosses, as when we think in terms of road signs that mean certain things. But thinking is the process of calculus. It is examining the world bit by bit, in series, one after another, one bit after another bit, as if we were looking at a dark room with the aid of a narrow-beamed spotlight and tracing it out all over the room, and then in memory piecing together the bits, the series of bits over which this beam passed. And then we construct from that what sort of a room this is. A floodlight would, of course, be quite different. With a floodlight like this, we see the whole room in a glance, and we don't have to bit it. But we see, actually, an enormous amount of things of which we never pay attention to. For example, if someone were to say about a particular woman at this gathering, was Mrs. So-and-so there this morning? I say, yes, she was there. She sat opposite me. What was she wearing? Well, I tell you, I have no idea. I saw it, but I didn't notice it. Why didn't I notice it? Because I wasn't interested. I might have been interested in her face, but I wasn't interested in what she was wearing. Therefore, I had no notation for it because it wasn't noteworthy. Now, you see then, when we use notation, what we do is we pay attention to those features of the environment which we have been taught to regard as significant, important. And then we stick a label on them. And that label is a word, a symbol of some kind, or a number. And in this way, we fragment the world into bits, called things, or events. Things are represented by noun labels, and events are represented by verb labels. And so we come to imagine that the world really does consist of separate things and events. And it doesn't. And that's a very difficult idea for people to grasp. The reason is, you see, that we found this method of thinking about the world so useful for predicting what will happen, for remembering what did happen, and in order to predict what will happen, it is based on remembering what did happen, that it's run away with us. And as a species, we are seriously in danger of being completely fooled by our own thinking processes. I can give some very simple illustrations of this. One of the main symbols which all civilized people use is money. It's a very convenient symbolism because it gets rid of the necessity for barter, of having to go down to the store with a truckload of eggs in order to buy some clothes. So we use money instead. And when you go to the supermarket and you roll up to the cashier a great cart full of goodies, And the girl goes, tickety, 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 and this long tape comes out. And she says, $30, please. Most housewives feel slightly depressed at parting with $30. Whereas they've got the real wealth in the cart. That's what you got. You got rid of some paper. But you've got edible goodies in the cart. Something's wrong with you. And we are witnessing right now a major crisis economically because of a stupid thing called gold, which has some use for filling teeth and making jewelry. But when hoarded in vast vaults and fortresses, it is completely useless, doing nothing. But the superstition, you see, that gold is wealth, or that money is wealth, is the confusion of the symbol with the reality. Take it far enough and people will start eating menus instead of dinners. And as a matter of fact, are so doing. Our bread, for example, the bread we eat in the ordinary way that you buy in the ordinary grocery, is symbolic bread. It is it is nothing but squishy styrofoam injected with allegedly nutritive chemicals. It is a conglomeration of plastic bubbles, which had some vague original connection with wheat. It is pure rat poison. The only trouble with it is that it isn't large enough or permanent enough to be used as a bolster. But this is being eaten all over in the superstition that this is food. It's symbolic food. It's an imitation of what Mama's new bread used to look like and feel like. You know, when it first came out of the oven, it was a little squishy, remember? That's what everybody was looking for, but they've been fooled. Same with the car. The average American car looks as if it were a streamlined, thundering rocket. Now, it isn't. Because an engine of that kind is not streamlined unless it's streamlined underneath as well as on top. And all it is a fake imitation of streamline plonked down with an open bottom on a chassis. They even have, Cadillacs have fake rocket exhausts on the backs with little vents as if there were an engine right somewhere in that thing, as a jet engine is in a capsule on a plane. You see, the thing is front. It's a pose. It's a fake. So you see, what is happening to us then is the ability to think has gone to our heads. And we have to go out of our minds to come to our senses. It's like, this has happened in the past, in the course of evolution. There was a prehistoric animal called a titanotheres, which was a sort of forebear of the rhinoceros. And it had a nose horn, which was, of course, a very useful weapon. But this thing kept developing the nose horn because it was so useful, until it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And at last the creature couldn't hold its head up, and it became extinct. Too much of a good thing. The dinosaurs became too big. They found bigness was an advantage over other animals, but they overdid it until they had to have one brain in the head and another in the rump. So that some caveman, you know, has a pet dinosaur, and when he goes to bed at night, he takes his club and bangs it on the tail, and it screams in time to wake him up in the morning. So it became extinct. So the human being can become extinct through overdoing his head, by thinking too much. Now, you see, when we think, as I pointed out, we equate some kind of symbol with what we call a separate event in the world. The symbols are separate from each other, but the things are not. This world is a great wiggly affair. Clouds are wiggly. Waters are wiggly. Plants are wiggly. Mountains are wiggly. People are wiggly. But people are always trying to straighten things out. Look, you see, we live in a rectangular boxes, all kinds. Look at the bookshelves, see? Everything's straightened out. So wherever you look around nature and you find things all being straightened out, you know people have been around. They're always trying to put things in boxes. Because boxes are classifiers, pigeonholes. Words are labels on boxes. But the real world is wiggly, wiggly, wiggly. Now, when you have a wiggly system like a cloud, how much wiggle is a wiggle? Well, you have to draw the line somewhere. And so people come to sorts of agreements about how much of a wiggle is a wiggle, that is to say, a thing. One wiggle. And always reduce any one wiggle into sub-wiggles. Or see it as a subordinate wiggle and a bigger wiggle. But there's no real fixed rule about it. Where does your head end and your neck begin? Oh, vaguely around here somewhere, but there's nothing really precise. Your head is very different from your feet. They don't look the same at all. But you don't find, in the normal course of events, heads running around without feet, or certainly feet running around without heads. They go together. And as your head and your feet go together, so do you as an organism and your physical environment. Bees and flowers, for example, look very different. But they are one organism. Because there's no bees without flowers, no flowers without bees. The flower opens itself and distributes perfume into the air. The bee, but it's rooted to the ground. The bee is independent and buzzes. But the thing is really a flower bee. That's what's going on. Just in the same way as inside you, your organs look very different from each other. The brain is very different from the stomach. But they're inseparable. So then, what happens in the confusion of symbol with reality is that eventually you confuse your idea of yourself with yourself. Your ego, what you mean by I in the ordinary way, is your conception of yourself. It is, as it were, the symbol for your actual living organism. And the one is not the other. And they belong to quite different orders of reality. The organism, as what I will for the moment call a physical reality, is of course a process. It is an energy system. It can do something. But the ego is a symbol and is not an energy system and cannot do anything. Just as you cannot tie up a parcel with the equator. The equator is an imaginary line, very useful for purposes of navigation, but must not be confused with a physical reality. So in just the same way, the ego, the concept of I, which is given a name, John Doe, Alan Watts, Mary Smith, or whatever it happens to be, is a concept. It's a method of tagging people. But it isn't real. Just as you cannot strangle someone with your telephone number. But it doesn't deny the usefulness of a telephone number. Now, how do you get this? How does it arise in anybody's individual life? I've traced the arising of it from the point of view of civilization as a whole, pointing out that when man developed symbolic systems, and they worked so well for him that he began to confuse the symbols with the reality. But now what about in one's personal life? Well, you see, when you're a little child, all your society around you, your parents, your teachers, your peers, are telling you who you are. It's very important to tag people. We get disconcerted by a person who doesn't have a tag. If I can't make out whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, why, you must be a communist. I feel safe with you if I know you're a Republican or a Democrat. Then I know what you're going to think about almost anything. You know, you can always tell. Somebody says, well, I'm a Bircher, or I'm a communist, or whatever he says. You can predict what he will think about almost any subject. That means he's stupid. Because anybody whose thinking is completely predictable is unintelligent. Because unadaptable to surprising situations. He won't know what to do about that. It doesn't say in the book what I'm supposed to think about that. Party line doesn't tell me. But we like to have people safely labeled in that way. And so it isn't only matters of political difference, but also religious, and also character types. We've read novels for so long that we believe characters should be consistent. There always are in novels, except in the new anti-novels. So that people aren't consistent at all. But they're supposed to be. And they're made to feel guilty if they're not. So what you learn to do in your education is to act a social role that is acceptable. You have several to choose from. I mean, with men, you can be the strong, silent type. You can be the intellectual, studious type. You can be the clown type. You can be a standard drunk. There are all sorts of more or less predictable roles that you can act in life and that you will get away with. So when, as a child, you one day met a child that you admired very much and you came home imitating that child's mannerisms, you bugged your mother because she didn't know who you were. Said, Johnny, that's not you, that's Peter. And made you feel guilty about that. But then you see what they do to you. I've just explained the system of social brainwashing. They say, now you, Johnny, are a person. A real person. At least you've got to try to be. And that means that you're a free agent. You're responsible. And you can be praised for the good things you do and blamed for the bad things you do. Because you're independent, you're free, you're separate. Now, the difficulty for a child is, little child especially, is it has no way of criticizing this information. Social pressure is irresistible. Everybody tells Johnny he's a free agent. So he believes he is. Why? Because he can't help it. See the paradox? He is compelled to be free. Then he's further told, now, we want free conduct out of you. We want you to love us. Not, of course, because we say so, but because you really want to. In other words, you are required to behave in such a way that will be acceptable only if you do it voluntarily. Now, no wonder everybody feels mixed up. Because we spend the rest of our lives trying to resolve that paradox. Well, there's the root of the matter, you see. That we have this confusion between our symbolic personality, on the one hand, and our living organism on the other. And it's the living organism that's real. We need to take a closer look at that, too. What sort of reality is that? Well, it's not what we think it is. It isn't a sort of a thing, it's a process. It would be better described by a verb than a noun. A body is a bodying. It's like a whirlpool in a stream. You can go every day and see the whirlpool is there in the same place. But no water stays in it. Because the whirlpool is a behavior. It's a dance. And you recognize it from day to day because it's the same dance from day to day, the same pattern. And you recognize a person from day to day because it's doing the same sort of dance. Or is the same sort of dance. You don't have to have an it that does the dance any more than when you say it is raining, there is some mysterious it that is doing the raining. The raining is raining, you see. So everybody is a dancing pattern in a stream of vegetables, beefsteak, milk, water, air, cosmic rays, heaven only knows what. But you're a certain kind of a jazz. And if you were aware of that, if you came to realize that your organism is you, you would make another startling discovery that your organism knows all the time, which is that it's one process with the rest of the world. Just as the sea waves, you can't isolate a wave, can you? There is waving. And as the sea is waving and the world is peopling, you are a wave of the world energy saying, yoo-hoo, I'm here, see? Take notice, what a funny thing I'm doing today, says the universe, with each one of you. And so, if, in other words, the organism, in its bones, shall we say, knows all that, but you don't know it with your conscious attention, because you can't get to look at yourself and you're confused with your ego, which is to say, your social role, your person. The word person means mask. Persona in Latin, that through which the sound comes. The megaphone mask worn by actors in Greco-Roman drama. So the word person coming to mean, when we say someone is a real person, that means it's a genuine fake. No, like some antiques. So, it is then as a result of this way, of this fragmented, broken up, bitty way of thinking about the world, that we feel disconnected, cut off, isolated. And therefore, since we cannot see the self directly, or experience it directly, as an object out there, we put all sorts of superstitions onto it. It's like people thinking about death. You can't imagine death. And so onto this void, one projects all sorts of things. People are afraid of death. They think, oh, what's it going to be like to go to sleep and never wake up? And they imagine themselves being shut up in the dark forever and get bugged by it. But on the other hand, when you start thinking about what will it be like to go to sleep and never wake up, suddenly it occurs to you that when you were born, you woke up without ever having gone to sleep. It's rather funny. And of course, if it happened once, it can happen again. And that begins to get you real puzzled about what you mean by you. But everybody feels he's I. Everybody has this sensation of being in the middle of everything. Turn around and see more or less equally in all directions, and you feel that you're in the center. Everybody feels in the center, just as much as I do. In fact, insects feel they're in the center, and I'm quite sure they feel that they're people. We don't, of course, don't bother to notice them in any great detail, and therefore they all look the same, and therefore we say, well, they're not people. They're all alike. They're some sort of mechanisms. Well, they look at us in just the same way, and they can't make any sense out of what we're doing. So we're some sort of funny mechanisms going around, so far as they're concerned. But so there's a lot of mystery hidden in this self that we have. Well, of course, you see, we're worried about it. We see the organism vanishes. We're always defending our personalities. And somebody accuses our personality of falling apart and say, now, you're not being consistent. You're not fulfilling what you said you would do. You're not playing the role you're supposed to play. Everybody feels that they're coming apart because they're not acting right, as on the stage. So we are constantly on the defensive. And also we're a prey to anxiety. Anxiety is a trembling motion. To be or not to be, that is the question. Because the minute you know you're alive, and really become aware of being alive, you realize that you might also be dead. Because to be implies not to be. And not to be, although we don't really think about that, implies to be. So we're always wondering, now if I do this, will I survive? Or would I better do that? We're never quite sure. Because you think when you get a really important decision, you've got to make it. You wonder, did I take everything into consideration? Did I make a sensible judgment? Well, you never know. Because in the best thought out plan, always chancy things occur. You don't know whether you're going to slip on a banana skin, or whether you're going to get sick. It's all very unpredictable. And therefore we tremble. Shall I do this? Shall I do that? See? Now, when it occurs to us, of course it doesn't in the ordinary way, that there is no choice between to be and not to be. Just as there's no choice between front and back. Space implies solid just as much as solid implies space. But conscious attention ignores that. It suffers from ignorance. We notice the figure and ignore the background. We notice the solid and ignore the space. We notice the relatively moving in smaller object, but we ignore the relatively stationary background. That's with consciousness, with noticing. And so you see, we don't notice that in order to be present, you must also be absent. Because life is an energy system. And energy is something that vibrates. And whatever vibrates goes on and off. If I sit next to a girl in the movies, and she attracts me, and I put my hand on her knee, and just leave it there, she will in due course cease to notice it. Because it's a constant stimulus. But if I gently stroke her or pat her on the knee, she will keep noticing it. Because it goes on and off. Now all energy systems go on and off. You can't know you're on unless you're off too. So we get waking and sleeping, we get every kind of rhythm. And there are tiny rhythms that go dig, 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 dig so fast, like a beam of light, that you don't notice the spaces, because your retina doesn't react quickly enough. It reacts to the stimulus of the on, but before it can go off, there's a new on. See? So you get what appears to be a constant stimulus. The table appears to be hard. It's vibrating so fast I can't put my finger through it. Same way as an airplane propeller appears to be solid, or an electric fan. But it's all going on and off. Now, there are these very fast vibrations of on and off, and there are very slow ones, like life and death. Now you see it, now you don't. That's what the world is. But because of the focusing of conscious attention, which regards on as real and off as unreal, because you ignore it, regards solid as real and space as unreal, it's like trying to think of waves as a series of crests without any troughs. But a wave is a crest trough. On off. So off is as important as on. You can't have anything happening without both. And although they are explicitly different, on and off, they're implicitly one. And we call it energy. So if these neglected and ignored features of the world came to our attention, or in some way could impinge upon our consciousness, we should feel very differently than we ordinarily do feel. How would you feel? Well, I can roughly describe it to you. It's a very odd feeling indeed, at first. You feel that what you are doing and what happens to you are the same. You can say of everything that happens to you, I'm doing it. And of everything that you are doing is that it happens to me. For example, when you're steering a car, are you pulling the wheel or pushing it? It's push-pull, isn't it? Both. Although the words push and pull are formally, logically opposed to each other. But that's what you're doing when you're steering. You're push-pulling. So in exactly the same way, when you are acting, what your environment does and what you do are the same process. So when you feel that, it's very odd. You feel as you walk up a hill, the hill is lifting you. That a lot of people go crazy with this because they suddenly say, well, I'm God. I'm doing everything. And if then they start to tell everybody that they're God, and people object and say, well, it's absolutely preposterous that you should say you're personally in charge of the whole universe, and therefore should be bowed down to and given divine honors, you must be mad. Or a person may take entirely the opposite point of view and say, I do nothing. I'm just a little puppet on the end of strings, and everything I do is controlled by something else. In other words, becomes a complete fatalist. What he doesn't see is that both points of view are right. But of course, this won't fit in with an idea of God, which is based on the ancient monarchies of the Near East. That is to say, it won't do with an idea of God conceived as the cosmic boss. The boss, the chief, that's a political image. And it just doesn't work too well for the Godhead. It leads to all sorts of trouble. And as I often say, for Americans, you'd believe, don't you, as American citizens, that a republic is the best form of government? How can you square that with thinking of heaven as a monarchy? If heaven is a monarchy, monarchy is the best form of government. What about democracy in the kingdom of heaven? How about that now? So, you have to conceive God in accordance with some different kind of image. Or maybe, wait a moment, maybe we shouldn't do that at all. Images of God are idolatry, aren't they? There are no image. Because every image is an idol, and idols that are made of imagination and thought are much more dangerous than idols made of wood or stone. Nobody takes a wooden idol seriously. You merely regard it as a symbol, and it's such an obvious symbol. But a concept that seems so spiritual, so abstract. But it's the most dangerous kind of idol, as we shall see when we come to the study of Buddhism, how it gets rid of all the conceptual idols. So then, if we woke up and became disillusioned, disenchanted, or unspellbound, you know, you spell words, and it's words that spellbind us. You hypnotize people by talking to them. So if we get free from the beguilement of words, we should wake up and find ourselves in this very different situation, where you would know that you and the universe are really the same process. You, as an organism, are an operation of the universe. The real you, though, is the whole thing. That's why in that rather fumbling proto-science called astrology, when you wanted to draw a picture of a person's soul, you drew a crude picture of the universe, his horoscope. Because your soul isn't in your body's in your soul. And your soul is the entire arrangement of forces constituting this universe, centered on your physical organism. So that's why the astrologer took the time and place of a person's birth and said, how are the heavens arranged around that? That's why the soul is in heaven. The meaning of that, it is heaven. It's the total arrangement of cosmic forces, the total pattern. And when you wake up to that and actually feel it to be so, I assure you it's just great. And you stop worrying about any, you still are sensible enough not to walk into a fire, but you get rid of that deep central anxiety. Because it's like the universe has nothing to fall onto if it drops. And a fall will only be disastrous if there's a floor of concrete down below. The universe has nothing to fall onto. Everything in it is dropping. The Earth is dropping around the sun. Just so long as there isn't a planet in the way or something like that, nothing happens. And the system as a whole. There isn't anything else. So why worry? Besides, if you disappear as an organism, great. Because if you went on too long, you get tired of yourself. And so there's always a new surprise in store. The thing is a self-surprising system. That's why it goes on. When you know the future perfectly, it's already past. You've had it. When you know the outcome of a game, and it becomes certain, you cancel it and begin another one. So to know too much gets you nowhere.